Welcome to the Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. This is a weekly podcast which looks at every aspect of something which has or will at some point affect us all. And that is grief. Whether you've lost a loved one or about to lose someone you know, or perhaps you're simply trying to help someone navigate their grief and don't know where to start or what to say, then perhaps this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be bringing you different stories and experiences of loss, love, hope, and at times humour. Mike McGrath-Bryan is a journalist and author of Have I Got Your Attention? A Guide to Adult ADHD in Ireland. Now, it's aimed at helping people who receive their diagnosis later in life. But the book also includes interviews with many ADHDers, allowing parents and others a glimpse of what it's like in the day-to-day world of a neurodivergent person. The book also highlights the positives as well as the hurdles that people go through before their actual official diagnosis and afterwards. Mike, you're very welcome on the Grief Pod.
Thanks a million for having me, Venetia. Lovely to be here.
I suppose, first of all, you got your diagnosis when you were 33.
Yeah, so I would have been well on by comparison around the same time that perhaps the neurodivergence conversation and the paradigms of what fell into it were changing and expanding and broadening. I went to get my initial consult, first of all, because I wasn't familiar with the conversation around things like self-identification, etc.
Yeah.
But by and large, I went in around the time that conversation was beginning to happen. It was during the pandemic, and having the conversations with my specialist, one thing led to another. Also a second conversation with members of my family, just to kind of get, other perspectives, I suppose.
Yeah, but
for lack of a better term.
Yeah. What actually prompted it? What was the I suppose, without using the word trigger, I suppose, what was the reason that you just went, I'm going to go and do this?
Well, like many people, I suppose, and especially many people in my position, I'd gone through life always feeling a little bit different. Like, there was a meeting I'd missed, or there was some understanding, I suppose, that I was never quite privy to. And, as a child, that was a bit of a source of loneliness. And then heading into your teenage rebellious phase, then it's obviously a sense of empowerment, finding your people. But I remember I was involved with, and still am involved with, the music scene here in Cork City. And I would have run gigs every second week at a pub on Tuckey Street called The Quad, which was a hangout for various alternatives, smelly hipsters, etc. And one of our regulars used to go to these gigs, would turn up at 7 o'clock, to look at the gear being loaded in and set up and any of this. And hanging out outside one of these gigs as soundcheck was happening, I noticed that she was kind of engaging in what we would refer to in autism as stimming, the regulatory behaviours to get excessive energy out. And I thought, I do that when I go home. I flap my hands and what have you and listen to loud music, but it's when the bedroom door is closed behind me. So there was always that kind of question mark over my head. And whenever COVID-19 happened, I turned around to my partner and went, right, I've been dealing with a lot. It's always felt like I've been dealing with a lot. I'm going to at least go for the consult. And if it isn't that, then at least we're one step closer. But it being the pandemic, it was like, we know there's going to be life after lockdown. We know there's going to be life for us after the fact, and there's things we're going to want to be doing. I want to be the best that I can be, and I want to know the most about myself that I can, that I can approach situations with the best self-knowledge possible.
Even at that point, the difficulty, I know my own experience in our family was that all diagnoses were being done over Zoom. So a lot of them were inconclusive. So did you go and do yours in person? I
didn't. Adult Autism.ie were up in Swords. I did mine over Zoom, and my family kind of had their interview over the phone with Dr. Kavanagh as well. And it was fairly conclusive. It would have been what they used to refer to as Asperger's syndrome, ASD1. And, after about 6 weeks of a post-diagnostic course, kind of very hand-holdy, very always kind of taking care of people after a significant diagnosis like that. My specialist said, so there might be a touch of ADHD as well. There's more research into the Venn diagram between autism, ADHD, and other forms of neurodivergence. being co-occurring. So about a year or so later, after going through the rigmarole of going through the private system for ADHD diagnosis, I received my official diagnosis as well. So I have a dual diagnosis, what we would refer to as ADHD. And when ADHD Ireland asked me to, as a journalist and as someone that's been writing for the likes of the Irish Examiner, the Echo down here in Cork, they asked me would I be involved in a project effectively bringing together all of the information and perspectives that are out there in one resource that people can pull down from the shelf and trust at a time of social media and noise and disinformation and AI and all this.
Yeah, because it's confusing and there's a lot out there, and it's, you know, even as a parent of a neurodivergent child, there's a lot that you're suddenly getting your head around. For you and for a lot of people that were diagnosed later in life, there can be a huge grief in the fact that you spent your whole childhood and your teenage years being on, as you said yourself, feeling different, undiagnosed. And do you ever look back and sort of go, this would have been different, or school would have been different, or college would have been different?
It's hard not to. But I think the one thing I told myself when I got diagnosed and kind of took a look at the circumstances around me was I'd always felt different. And, you know, there was always that question over my head of like, why is it that I don't feel that I can connect to, you know, others in the way that, you know, the in-group seem to be able to do so. And I suppose as a child, you internalize that as there's something wrong with me. As a teenager, then you internalize that as, you know, it's them and us. And as you get older and you find more of your people and you settle into the life that that plays out for you and you chase the things that you really want. When you reach that point there where you're in the position to turn back and go, things would have been different, things might have been different. The grief for me hit, I suppose, in just the snatches of memory of like, you know, feeling like I didn't understand anybody as a child, even though I was loved and I did have friends, don't get me wrong, but just looking at the wider world and with a literal sense and going, what are all these winks and nods that I'm missing? Or the understanding better, I suppose. Yeah, or understanding better, like what drove me to find my passions and what drove me to find the people that became my friends, that became my partner. And yeah, there's the sense, there's the obvious sense of grief in this. It's complicated in that, you know, the system wasn't there for us. You know, we were failed by a system that failed to pick up or to place in the proper context what was happening to myself and tens of thousands of other adults in the Irish education system and indeed beyond. You know, there's talk of a lost generation. And there's also the secondary grief of, well, there's nowhere to put that because it's not necessarily, you know, anybody's fault. I mean, while research and such may have gone on, it would have been very much within circles that are informed in this, certainly primary school teachers of the 1990s, secondary school teachers of the 2000s, youth clubs, like local music scenes. Nobody's going to know exactly what we know now. And so the idea of where there's the frustration of like how things could have been different, and they could have been different. There's both the idea of, well, I don't have anywhere that I can put this. There's nobody to blame. There's no door that you can lay this at. There's just the idea of, I know this about myself now. It's time to look into how I can accommodate and facilitate myself and my loved ones, including friends that are also have been diagnosed or are getting diagnosed, or understanding people that are going through the same thing. And then for people that are younger than me, you know, whether it's in workplaces, communities, etc., that people, you know, tend to find their way to me to have conversations like this, etc., that I can hopefully advocate for systemic change, because it's one thing to have awareness of ADHD and autism, but it's quite another to have acceptance where in the system, you know, that's factored into how things operate, how workplaces operate, how colleges and schools operate. And while it is certainly improving, etc., you know, there's a certain, say, for example, I went home to my home village of Ballyclaw, where the cheese used to be made in County Cork. And I was invited to give a speech for a fundraiser for a youth autism facility in Cork City. They were raising funds because one of the local kids goes there once a week. And I was hit by, you know, a sense of full circle that I'm in the hall that I grew up in, playing indoor soccer and getting picked last for the matches, etc. But then down the hill in the school where, I wondered what was wrong with me. There's now autism facilities. There's now sensory areas and any of this. So I suppose it's the natural passage of time creates both, acceptance, a little bit of grief and of mourning, but also of the great optimism that kind of comes from having that better self-knowledge, that better self-compassion, and that better ability to apply it to yourself, to others, and to the wider context.
Just talking there about your school and the hall and being picked last for the soccer team or whatever, what do you remember of being a child and how you saw everybody else around you?
There was family that I loved. There was close friends of my family that I knew and understood, or at the very least could observe closely. But things like going to school and, the unwritten rules of socializing among children, going to secondary school and kind of subverting that by finding other weirdos in black hoodies or people toting video games machines, that kind of thing. And I suppose the way I thought of it, and I suppose I only kind of reached this conclusion in my late teens before I ever went and got diagnosed, was that seemingly a lot of people, especially in, say, smaller areas or smaller towns, rural areas where there's an established understanding of things.
Yeah.
That you felt a little bit like everyone had the fishbowl over their head or their astronaut helmet and they were kind of clanking off of each other. And that was kind of, I suppose, that before I ever went to get a consult or diagnosed, that's how I kind of, I suppose that's how I reconciled my own experience with observing the world kind of take place and gradually get a better understanding of it as I got older.
And emotionally, how did you find it from a regulation?
The process of diagnosis?
No, looking back on your childhood and looking back on, because emotional regulation, rejection sensitivity, all the little parts that can be a hurdle, I guess, for, a younger person. How did you find that? They
were significant hurdles. I'm not going to lie to you. I moved school a little bit. I found it hard to keep friends, or if there was friendship situations, if it wasn't a case of, there was a bonding over an immediate interest, it would, it oftentimes just seemed to be from like physical proximity, whether school or what have you. And, like many of us growing up finding ourselves, etc., there would have been mixed results. There are some people that, I grew up with that I still talk to this day. There are others that, pursued the life that was kind of put in front of them of, you get the job, you get the degree, you go do the good thing, and you kind of cross all of life's social milestones at the expected time, etc. And that's no shade on anybody that does so. But there's definitely the case of when I go back home, the friends that I've held on to, whether through primary school, secondary school, where I come from, there's definitely the sense of, having found the tribe, and a little bit of a neurodivergent magnet as well, don't get me wrong. But I suppose the outstanding memories of, if there was a tremendous loneliness being very young and taking everybody literally and, not quite putting two and two together on the things that everyone else seemed to kind of understand implicitly, then there was also a tremendous sense of relief and of liberation in finding like mind in other contexts, like, local music scenes, like the gang of smelly hoodie wearers in secondary school, or, I dropped out of college a couple of times, but every single time I did happen across people that were in similar situations until I finally got my master's about 10 or so years ago. And if, you can't have that sense of liberation, you can't have that having made friends, you can't have that sense of self-understanding if you had not been through the sense of having felt alone, of having felt excluded, of having felt othered. And even when, loved ones and family members would have the conversation with you of there has to be a happy medium, and you don't necessarily know where to start because all you're seeing is the other kids, quote unquote, getting it their way. Now, obviously, with adult empathy and with knowledge of your autism diagnosis, there is that idea of, well, there's rigidity of thought, there's fairness or injustice sensitivities, there's rejection sensitivities for you at play. When you don't know all that, and things are just happening when life is happening to you raw, I suppose.
The rejection thing is huge. Like, it's upsetting for the parents as well, because they can
Yeah.
see it. It's upsetting for the child, obviously, but it's like there's all the different forms of rejection, whether it's from education, whether it's peers, whether it's, I guess, also in your own mind that you are being rejected when maybe you aren't.
Well, I mean, when we talk about parents, etc., I was very lucky in that while our household was quite busy, my mother was always quite attuned to my feelings, and my father, always had bits and pieces to say and knowledge to drop regarding my various interests, music, computers, technology, etc. And so, where there's that kind of, even before we had the language, I suppose, of this. Of course, when I look back on it now, and I think my parents, myself and my sister, presented different challenges to them, not only as their kids, but as, little human beings in our own right, with our own ideas and our own ways and means of getting about things. And I can only imagine how it must have been, obviously, for my folks to have seen myself and my sister, undergo the different trials and tribulations that affect somebody that's adolescing and finding their way in the world. But as far as rejection sensitivity and any of this, I mean, I did feel it acutely. There was a sense of bringing myself to other people's tables, honestly, with the best of intentions, the best of heart, and more often than not, obviously, finding good people to chat with or making friends, etc. But sometimes just meeting other people that there's personality differences,
Yeah.
and when you experience that so much more keenly, or when you experience that um, so much more sharply, it does leave its mark. But by that same token, post diagnosis, thinking of all of the things that could have been different, thinking of all of the things I went through, I can be a person for, hopefully for others, that is not going to treat them the same, or is going to be aware of what it is to live with rejection sensitivity dysphoria, to have those issues with social cues, to wake up in the morning and not know what way is up, and slowly but surely put sense on executive dysfunction as ADHD presents, on a day-to-day basis. I mean, just because me and Ailes wrote the book on ADHD doesn't necessarily mean that we suffer it any less. It just means that we've been handed the manual to the video game, and we know how to throw the blue shells. Doesn't make it any easier, just so you can strategize.
Yeah. But just even from the rejection sensitivity, but also the whole idea of empathy. I mean, obviously now it's talked about a lot more. There's starting to be a lot more conversations in the media and all that sort of stuff. But a while ago, I was talking to Amy De Bruyne, whose son, she wrote the short drama Samhain about her son's diagnosis. And one of her griefs, she said in the interview, was that like her son was being brought into a world that wasn't ready yet.
Yeah.
Do you still think that's the case? Do you think we're not quite really there yet as a society?
I think the opening up of conversation and the widening of ideas around what autism is and what ADHD is has helped massively. I mean, prior to the last couple of years, if you said autism to the man on the street or the woman in the street or the other in the street, they'd say Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man.
Yeah.
Or if you said hyperactivity to somebody, they'd think of
Jim Carrey,
the young fella in the class, the classroom bouncing off the walls, etc. We don't think about the person that is masking really hard to fit in, that just comes off like a try hard. We're not talking about the young woman in the classroom that is staying quiet because society tells her not to externalize her overwhelm, or even the owl fella, going all toad of Toad Hall on his hobbies in retirement, or not knowing what to do with himself. So with a wider awareness of what different aspects of neurodivergence present, and it's not just autism or ADHD.
Yeah.
I mean, the sociological conversation around neurodivergence comes down to dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette's syndrome, as recent pop culture discussions had, Down syndrome, etc. So in a wider awareness of different neurotypes, neurological differences, etc., there is the baseline, I suppose, that is coming into play now, and whether it's on an institutional basis, obviously, where some workplaces are better than others, or where we're seeing uh, reform committees in the Dáil for ADHD and autism, as well as the education system obviously bringing itself up to snuffleupagus, the media conversation,
Mm.
which still has a way to travel, of course,
Yeah.
just owing to the natural state of media in this day and age, where some people are more willing to chase heat than shed light.
Mm.
But by and large, I think most definitely in the last 5 years, we've moved toward a space now where we can begin to move from awareness to acceptance, and that it's not deal with the God help us or have patience for somebody that's different. It is
Accept.
what are
Yeah.
not only accept, but what are the variables that are at play from person to person. How can we facilitate and accommodate same in our workplaces, in our public institutions, in our education systems, all the way up to third level and beyond, and how can we move toward a space where other areas of society are growing, thankfully, more pluralistic, and physical and mental disability, social disabilities, neurodivergence, neurotypes, etc., need to be part of that conversation. Now, by and large, we need to move toward a more pluralistic society
Yeah.
a lot quicker in many ways, specifically where, as you say, so much disinformation, so much fear and paranoia out there is beginning to turn perfectly good people rancid. But that's another conversation for another time.
There's for parents though, there's a grief around the whole diagnosis part when it comes to, I mean, I suppose it's a type of ambiguous loss as well, that you have an idea how your child is going to, what their path is going to be, or how you imagine the life is going to be. You haven't factored in all the sort of hurdles along the way because that didn't come into your mind at any point. For your parents, did they find that even though you hadn't been diagnosed? Did they find it difficult to, I suppose, the struggle and the battle to keep, because you're on constant support, you're always fighting and supporting your child?
I can't speak for my parents,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to speak in their stead. I'm going to state that, as with any familial relationship, there are the things over which, yourself and your loved ones can bond. There are ways and means in which you're going to differ, and where variances of understanding and variances of attention are at play. Of course, that's going to require, a lot more involved conversations. But when you come back to an ambiguous loss, like, I'm not a parent. I'm not going to claim to speak for those that, whose kids have been diagnosed. And again, even just thankfully, even the fact that the system and things are a lot better and those hurdles are a lot less substantial. What I will say is it's a difference in the trajectory. It's a difference in, it's the difference between how things are playing out versus your ideas or your expectations or your your wanted outcomes. And of course, you love your child, you want the very best for them. It's a matter of adjusting to what comes easiest or most natural to the child, to find the various supports to allow them to find that, whether it's SNAs and SENs, whether it's extracurricular activity, or even just finding others of a like mind to find into or to fit into a social grouping along the lines of their interests or their aesthetics or their passions, etc. I don't know how to feel about parents framing their kids' diagnosis as grief or loss, because I'm sure if you went back however long ago, and if they had, then what they have now for me, and I got diagnosed as a kid, my mother wouldn't look at it as losing the son she would have had. It would have been knowing more of the son and the young man that is. And, credit to my mother, credit to my father. They saw the things that I loved and that I took an interest in. And they always nudged me down that path. I'm a writer because my mother was also quite good with words. My grandfather would have been a writer as well. My father would have played bass in like the local cover bands, etc., and would have always had a keen interest in music. So there wasn't so much an alienation from the wider world where, there was a wire directly to the things that I loved, and the people that knew enough about it to talk about it and to nurture those interests and send me in the right directions. I'll tell you a story. I failed my leaving cert because I completely flopped at my maths. Otherwise, I would have ended up in arts in UCC, I'm sure, but because
You
I
needed
always struggled
maths.
with numbers,
Yeah.
etc., it was the one thing. And I remember having a little bit of a pity party for myself. My best friend had passed away the year prior. I had broken my ankle, so I was on some very good medication. And, all of these things had kind of lent to not necessarily being able to study or do the
Yeah.
brainstorming and any of this. And I remember waking up a couple of days after it, and my mum kind of knocking on the door and throwing the pamphlet from the local FETAC college at me and saying, look, sound engineering and music technology, go do that. I think where you have your head on a swivel regards what your child is really into or has a natural knack for. The destination is the same ultimately, but the paths are much more manifold than maybe societal milestones would have been before. So you're you know you're within your rights to go, oh feck, this is going to be a lot different than it would have been, and the public system, and even the private system, the supports simply aren't there, and there's going to be a fight to get your hands on them, to maintain them, and then to have that bridge to adulthood when those services expire, when the child turns 18. And again, I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody that's decent with words. There are others whose needs are far different than mine, and I can't speak for somebody that's fighting and advocating for that the whole time. But what I will say is lean into what it is about the child or the young person that gives them the lust for life to go out and do the things that they want to do, and see how you can facilitate that and channel that energy correctly.
Absolutely. There's in your book, the artist Helen Steele is one of the people you talk to, and she refers to having ADHD as having a stigma. Do you still feel that it's a stigma?
I will state that I suppose in taking questions for media appearances around the book lately, a lot of people have been kind of coming up to me, well intended, with the strapline, oh, ADHD, it's a superpower. But the same people that kind of mean well with that and want to kind of look at the positives of hyperfocus, look at the positives of the ability to put all your energy in one direction. They're not seeing the burnout that happens around it. They're not seeing the exhaustion afterwards. They're not seeing the difficulty with day-to-day function that comes with kind of monotropism that especially presents itself with dual diagnosis. And for sure, navigating a world that's not made for you, or is still increasingly tricky to do even with the current accommodations. Things like working a 9 to 5, being in an office space where social cues and social skills, the winks and nods, are so much more important. I still think while the bits and pieces are in place in different parts of society, the public system is obviously getting better. The private sector varies from place to place. The healthcare system and even the housing crisis kind of goes into this as well, because if you're house hunting as an adult that's also autistic, you might be missing out on opportunities to talk with people, or ADHD, executive dysfunction. If your partner has to drag you through applying for a mortgage and doing the paperwork for it as well, that presents its disadvantages too. Everything is connected in that regard, and I would state that I would always refer to the social model of disability, wherein we're only as disabled, quote unquote, we're only as disordered, quote unquote, as the system that disables or disorders us. And hopefully with a wider spread of systemic change, and hopefully with a wider spread of change within communities. But the wider things that affect people, like the complete lack of investment in healthcare that's led us to trolley crisis, the complete lack of investment from government in council housing and affordable housing, and specialist housing too, that's led us to a homelessness crisis that affects everybody. Until we have complete infrastructural change, hopefully from the bottom up, and preferably from the bottom up, that addresses the needs of a wide variety, from the physically disabled, from mentally disabled, from people with different neurotypes, all the way up to the elderly, students, people that are dealing with changing life circumstances, the long-term unemployed, etc. Until we have a system and a society that is better able, better resourced, and with politicians and legislators and senior civil servants that are more willing to put those systems in place rather than simply hope that throwing money at the issue or hope that, that they can put a band-aid over the shotgun wounds of systemic inequity. Those stigmas, for better or worse, those,
There you
that
go.
asterisk
Yeah.
will always be in place. And it's not just for neurodivergent people.
And there's a lot of people, I suppose, well-known people who are coming out now and saying they've just had a recent diagnosis. I mean, a lot of people think it's a bandwagon thing, but then that's part and parcel of what you've just said and how we need to improve, basically.
Yeah.
Can I ask you just finally, like, now at having lived your childhood and your teenage years and, with your diagnosis, what would you like neurotypical people to know about you?
I will say that, at the minute with the media climate that we have, for better or worse, the consumption model has shifted from newspapers, magazines, weeklies, radio, etc., being able to put out content that people will pay attention to and that experts are able to go on the radio and speak in their area of expertise and that people will give it a fair shot. We're not in the age of the Greeks anymore. We're in the age of the Romans. And unfortunately, the tendency for certain corners of media, certain corners of discourse and debate and certain actors on social media is to chase heat rather than shed light. That means saying, oh, everybody's a little bit, or oh, sure, they're all chasing after that now, and this, that, and the other. And where conversations are emerging and where people are finding out more about themselves, there are always going to be bad actors that stand ready to take advantage of people's fear of change, take advantage of people's uncertainty around how, the world is changing around them, how their loved ones or their friends might be affected. And it might be a case of fear that if someone is getting diagnosed, that somebody close to you is going, but are you a God help us now? Are you not going to be able to stay in your job and this, that, and the other? And there's a lot of ignorance out there that is being preyed upon, say, for example, by people saying, oh, autism diagnosis, ADHD diagnosis, that's just over medicalizing human nature. Right. Human nature is not as easy as one thing. And was it Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, said, from the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing is ever made. And if any of us are going to be able to better understand themselves, and if any of us have spent our lives wondering, why am I like this? To be able to pivot from that to go, okay, here are the internal factors, here are the external factors, here's what I need, here's how I can articulate that to my loved ones and to my bosses and to people in my institutions, and here's how I can slowly but surely come to terms with myself. If you could take that quote unquote label, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And so when you ask me the question of what do I want neurotypical people to know about me, neurodivergence is a difference in neurotype. It can be neurodevelopmental. It's all manner of external and internal things. It varies from aspect to aspect, from autism to ADHD to Tourette's to even things like acquired brain injury and the effect that it can have for people. It's a matter of difference. It's not less than. It's not God help us. It is I think this way. I perceive the world this way. I have this neurotype. There are these variances in my attention. There are these variances in my social abilities and in my social battery. There are these variances in how I perceive the world, and there are these things that I react to differently than others. There are these other things that don't bother me at all. And it's just a case of, rather than asking me, if a person were to come up and ask me, how do I as a neurodivergent person feel about the world or about how I'm perceived, I'd ask people to take a look within themselves about what are the assumptions they're making and how to apply those against the rest of the world and how understandings are changing.
Okay. It's fascinating I think everyone should read it, actually. The book is called Have I Got Your Attention? A Guide to Adult ADHD in Ireland. And Mike, I think your dedication in the book for our mammies who never gave up on us is, I know loads of those mammies, and I think that is just something that so many of them would appreciate.
I'm my mother's son. I wouldn't let the occasion pass without it, and I don't think Aileen, my co-author, would have let it pass without talking about her mam either.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. You can listen on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. We also have an online community on Facebook, The Grief Pod, or on Instagram at Grief Pod Series.